The mansion stood in eerie silence, its Gothic spires piercing the moonlit sky. Inside, a macabre ceremony was underway. Blood-red candles lined the long dining table, casting shadows on the walls that twisted like tortured souls. At the head of the table sat her, the bride. Her beauty was ethereal, almost otherworldly. Her porcelain skin glowed against the stark white of her wedding dress, stained at the hem with what appeared to be dried blood. Long raven-black hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her full lips curved into a seductive smile that promised both ecstasy and doom, but she wasn't a bride in the conventional sense. Her groom was her next victim, a man seduced by her charm and beauty. He was strapped to a chair at the center of the room, trembling as she circled him like a predator. "You promised forever, didn't you?" She purred, her voice dripping with mock affection. The man struggled, his wrists raw from the ropes biting into his flesh. His muffled screams filled the room as she leaned closer, her dark eyes glittering with malice. "Don't worry," she whispered, pressing a cold blade to his cheek. "Forever starts now." The first cut was deliberate, a slow, agonizing slice along his chest. Blood pooled, staining his white shirt crimson. She licked the blade, her eyes fluttering shut as if savoring the taste. Her beauty turned monstrous in the flickering candlelight. Her smile widening as his muffled screams grew louder. "I've done this before, you know," she said, her tone almost conversational. "Every groom thinks they'll be the one to change me. That their love will save me. But love doesn't save, love kills." The room bore witness to her cruelty. Hooks dangled from the ceiling, still wet with gore from her previous victims. Instruments of torture, pliers, scalpels, and branding irons, were meticulously arranged on a silver tray. Each one had a story, and each story ended in. He worked methodically, stripping away his flesh and dignity piece by piece. Her movements were as graceful as a dancer's, her beauty only heightening the horror of her actions. The man's eyes rolled back in his head as she carved intricate patterns into his skin, her laughter echoing off the walls. "You'll be my masterpiece," she whispered, her voice thick with lust and madness. Hours later, his lifeless body hung from the hooks, a grotesque parody of a marionette. She stood before him, admiring her work. Her dress, once white, was now soaked in blood, clinging to her curves. She was the perfect blend of seduction and savagery, a siren who lured men to their doom, as she cleaned her tools. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Another man, drawn by her beauty and charm, had arrived. She turned, her crimson-stained lips curling into a wicked smile. "Another groom," she murmured. "Till death do us part." The mansion erupted in screams once more, the bride's haunting laughter rising above the symphony of agony. The new arrival stepped into the room, his confident smile faltering as he took in the gruesome scene before him. His breath hitched at the sight of the dangling corpse, its face unrecognizable, its flesh carved like grotesque art. Yet his gaze returned to her, unable to resist the allure of her blood-drenched beauty. "Am I late to the celebration?" he asked. Trying to mask his unease with charm, she tilted her head, a coy smile playing on her lips. "You're just in time, darling." The room seemed to shift as she approached, her movements hypnotic, her heels clicking on the blood-slicked floor. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, he forgot the horror around him. She reached out, her fingers trailing along his jawline, her touch icy. "Do you believe in fate?" she whispered, her lips so close he could feel her breath. Before he could answer, pain exploded in his side. He looked down to see the hilt of a knife protruding from his ribcage. He smiled sweetly, twisting the blade with a deliberate slowness that made his knees buckle. "Fate brought you to me," she said, her voice soft, almost tender. "And now, it will deliver you to your end." He staggered backward, clutching at the wound, his blood spilling in hot streams between his fingers. Panic surged through him as he realized the door he had entered was now locked. She moved with predatory grace, the hem of her dress dragging through the growing pool of crimson. "I've had so many grooms," she mused, retrieving a pair of long, gleaming scissors from the table. "But you might be my favorite." He lunged toward a chair, grabbing it and swinging it wildly in her direction. She sidestepped with ease, her laughter ringing out like a twisted lullaby. "Fight all you want," she said, advancing on him. "It only makes it more fun." The scissors slashed through the air, catching his forearm and slicing deep into the muscle. He screamed, the chair clattering to the ground as he fell to his knees. She loomed over him, her silhouette framed by the flickering candlelight, her eyes alight with sadistic glee. Grabbing him by the hair, she dragged him to the center of the room, ignoring his feeble attempts to resist. She bound his wrists with practiced efficiency, securing him to a wooden contraption that resembled a medieval torture rack. "This," she said, gesturing to the array of tools laid out before her, "is where the real fun begins." She started with the branding iron, its glowing tip hissing as it met his skin. The smell of burning flesh filled the room, mingling with his agonized screams. She hummed a haunting melody, pausing only to admire her work before moving on to the next instrument of torment. Each tool brought a new wave of pain, each scream a new note in her symphony of suffering. She carved intricate patterns into his flesh, her precision almost surgical. His pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears, her focus unshakable, her joy palpable. As the hours stretched on, the man's struggles grew weaker, his voice hoarse from screaming. Yet she showed no signs of stopping, her sadistic energy seemingly endless. She leaned in close, her lips brushing against his ear. "Do you know why I do this?" she whispered. "Because love is pain. And I want you to feel every ounce of mine." A faint knock echoed from the mansion's front door, startling her. She straightened, her expression darkening. "Stay here," she said, as if he had a choice. She disappeared into the shadows, leaving him alone in the blood-soaked room. The faint sound of her heels clicking against the floor faded into silence. The man's heart raced, hope surging as he realized someone else might be here to save him. But when she returned, she wasn't alone. Two figures followed her, a young couple whose faces were a mixture of fear and confusion. "Welcome," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "You're just in time to witness a love story." Before they could react, she slammed the door shut, locking them in. The bride's laughter echoed through the room as she reached for her tools, her eyes gleaming with sadistic anticipation. "Let's make this a wedding to remember," she said, her voice a chilling promise of the horrors yet to come. The young couple backed away, their faces pale as they took in the horrific scene. The man hanging limply from the rack was barely recognizable, his body a mutilated canvas of blood and agony. The bride turned toward them, her smile radiant and grotesque in equal measure. "Oh, don't be shy," she cooed, her voice laced with sinister charm. "You're my guests of honor." The man of the couple, tall and broad-shouldered, tried to shield his partner. "We don't want any trouble," he said, his voice trembling despite his attempt at bravery. The bride chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Trouble?" She twirled a scalpel between her fingers with unnerving grace. "You're not in trouble. You're in love's embrace, and love is transformative." She lunged without warning, the scalpel slicing through the man's arm as he tried to block her. He cried out, clutching his wound, as the bride turned her attention to the woman. "You're beautiful," she murmured, stepping closer, her bloodied hands reaching out. "You could have been a bride, just like me." The woman screamed, darting to the side and grabbing a candle holder. She swung it wildly, the heavy metal catching the bride on the shoulder. The bride stumbled but only laughed, a sound that sent chills through the couple. "I love when they fight," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. The man grabbed his injured arm, motioning for his partner to run. "Go. Find a way out." But as the woman turned, she collided with a hidden lever on the wall. The sound of grinding metal filled the air as hidden steel bars slid down over the windows and doors, sealing them in. The bride clapped her hands in mock delight. "Perfect timing," she said. "Now no one has to leave early." The man lunged at her, desperation giving him strength. He tackled her to the ground, pinning her beneath him. For a moment, it seemed like they had a chance. But the bride's expression remained eerily calm. With a flick of her wrist, she produced a small, concealed blade and drove it into his side. He gasped, collapsing as blood gushed from the wound. The bride pushed him off her, standing gracefully despite her torn dress and disheveled hair. Her beauty seemed almost supernatural, untouched by the carnage around her. The woman screamed, rushing to her partner's side. She pressed her hands to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but he was already growing pale. Touching, the bride said, her voice dripping with mockery. But love won't save him now. She grabbed the woman by the hair, dragging her away from her partner despite her kicks and screams. The bride threw her into a chair, binding her with ropes in a matter of seconds. The woman's eyes wide with terror. You'll learn, the bride said, retrieving a long, serrated blade. Love demands sacrifice. The man groaned from the floor, his movements sluggish as he tried to reach her. The bride noticed, tilting her head with curiosity. How noble, she said, walking over to him. She knelt, her blade glinting in the candlelight. Shall we see how much you're willing to endure for her? She began slowly, pressing the blade against his cheek and dragging it downward. His screams filled the room, the sound raw and haunting. The woman thrashed in her bonds, tears streaming down her face as she begged for mercy. Stop it. Please. She cried. The bride looked up, her expression serene. Oh, darling. Mercy is a lie. She stood, leaving the man writhing on the floor, and returned to the woman. She traced the blade along her captive's jawline, her touch almost tender. Tell me, she whispered. Do you love him? The woman sobbed, nodding frantically. Yes. Please, let him go. The bride's smile widened. Prove it. She retrieved a pair of pliers from the table, holding them up so the woman could see. Sacrifice something for him. A finger, perhaps. Or an eye. The woman's screams were muffled as the bride forced a gag into her mouth, ensuring her pleas wouldn't interrupt the ritual. The bride worked methodically, her movements elegant despite the grotesque violence of her actions. The night stretched on, filled with the sounds of agony and despair. The bride moved between her captives, her laughter mingling with their cries. The walls of the mansion seemed to absorb the noise, the blood, the terror, feeding on the darkness within. By dawn, silence reigned once more. The couple's broken bodies lay motionless, their love extinguished in a sea of blood. The bride stood in the center. Beyond the locked doors and barred windows, the sound of footsteps approached. Another guest had arrived. The bride smiled. The night was far from over. The heavy sound of boots echoed down the hallway outside the locked chamber. The bride tilted her head, her bloodied fingers trailing lazily over the serrated blade in her hand. A new visitor. The thought sent a shiver of excitement down her spine. She wiped her hands on her tattered gown, leaving streaks of crimson, and stepped toward the door. As the footsteps grew louder, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the handle. Whoever was out there wasn't cautious. They wanted her to hear them coming. Intriguing. She opened the door with a slow creak, revealing a man in his late 30s, tall and rugged, holding a crowbar. His eyes swept over her, narrowing at the blood smeared across her gown and face. Where are they? He demanded, his voice steady but edged with fury. The bride's lips curled into a smile. You'll have to be more specific, darling. My guest list is rather extensive. He pushed past her, his eyes landing on the horrors within the room. His face twisted in rage as he spotted the mutilated couple. The man on the floor let out a faint groan, barely alive, and the newcomer rushed to his side. Stay with me, he muttered, his voice breaking. I'll get you out of here. The bride leaned against the doorframe, her expression one of amused indifference. How touching. But I'm afraid his time is up. The man stood, his grip tightening on the crowbar. You did this? She raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. Do you see anyone else here? With a roar, he charged at her, swinging the crowbar. She sidestepped easily, her laughter ringing out as his weapon struck the wall. Before he could recover, she darted forward, her blade slicing across his arm. He hissed in pain, retreating as she advanced. "You're brave," she said, her voice low and sultry. "But bravery won't save you," again, this time grazing her shoulder. The bride's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of anger. She lashed out, her blade finding his thigh. He stumbled, blood soaking his jeans, but he didn't fall. "Why?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" The bride tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Because love is pain," she said softly. "And pain is the only thing that's real." She lunged at him, but this time he was ready. He swung the crowbar with all his strength, the metal colliding with her side. She cried out, the force of the blow knocking her to the ground. He didn't hesitate. He brought the crowbar down again and again, each strike fueled by rage and desperation. The bride's laughter turned to screams, her body convulsing as the weapon connected with flesh and bone, but even as her blood pooled around her, she didn't stop smiling. "You think you've won?" she rasped, her voice weak but defiant. "You're just like me. You've spilled blood. Taken a life. Tell me, how does it feel?" The man froze, the crowbar slipping from his grasp. Her words wormed their way into his mind, twisting his thoughts. "You'll never forget this moment," she whispered. "No matter how far you run, no matter how hard you try to move on. You're mine now." Her body went limp, her head lolling to the side. The man staggered back, his chest heaving as he stared at the lifeless figure before him. Behind him, the faint sound of laughter echoed through the room. He turned, his heart racing, but the source of the sound was nowhere to be seen. The man helped the injured couple to their feet, their groans of pain pulling him back to the present. Together, they stumbled out of the mansion, the oppressive darkness lifting with each step, but as they reached the safety of the road, the man couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned back, his eyes scanning the mansion's shattered window. In one of them, a figure stood, bathed in the dim glow of the rising sun. The bride, her body pristine, her gown spotless, waved at him with a bloodied hand. Her laughter followed him as he fled into the dawn, a haunting melody that would echo in his mind forever. The man's breath came in ragged gasps as he guided the injured couple down the empty road. The mansion loomed in the distance, its oppressive presence a reminder that what they had escaped might not stay confined within those walls. The woman, barely conscious and bleeding from her binds, murmured weakly. She's not human." The man didn't answer. He didn't know what to believe anymore. His thoughts were consumed by the image of the bride. Alive and unscathed, waving at him from the mansion window, a chilling wind swept through the trees, carrying with it an eerie whisper that sounded disturbingly like her laughter. He stopped abruptly, his instincts screaming that they weren't alone. "Keep moving," he urged the couple, his voice trembling. They stumbled forward, their injuries slowing their pace. The man tightened his grip on the crowbar, the weight of it both reassuring and sickening. He couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't killed her. Not really. A rustling sound came from the dense forest lining the road. He spun around, holding the crowbar defensively. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, forming shapes that dissolved the moment he tried to focus on them. "She's here," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. The man's knuckles turned white as he tightened his grip on the weapon. "No. She's dead. I made sure of it." A soft, melodic hum echoed through the forest. It was a familiar tune, one the bride had been humming in the mansion. The sound grew louder, closer, wrapping around them like a suffocating fog. The couple panicked, their fear overtaking their pain. The man turned to calm them, but before he could speak, the bride's voice came from love. She stepped out of the shadows, her wedding gown pristine once more, the blood gone as if it had never been there. Her eyes gleamed with a predatory light, and her smile was as captivating as it was horrifying. The man swung the crowbar instinctively, but she moved with inhuman speed, catching it mid-swing. Her grip was impossibly strong, and with a flick of her wrist, she ripped the weapon from his hands. "Violence suits you," she said, her tone almost teasing. But it's no match for devotion. She turned her attention to the injured couple, her gaze softening in mock tenderness. "You've been such lovely guests," she said. "But it's time we solidify your commitment." Before the man could react, she grabbed the woman by the arm, dragging her away. The woman screamed, her voice raw with terror, as the bride's nails dug into her skin, drawing fresh blood. "Let her go." The man shouted, rushing forward. The bride turned, her expression darkening. "You're so eager to save her," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Would you die for her? Suffer for her?" The man hesitated, his heart pounding. The bride smiled, sensing his doubt. "That's what I thought." She threw the woman to the ground and advanced on him instead. He stumbled back, tripping over a tree root and falling hard. The bride loomed over him, her blade glinting in the moonlight. "Love is sacrifice," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "And you've given nothing." She raised the blade, but before it could descend, the injured man from the couple lunged at her with a shard of glass he had picked up from the road. He drove it into her back, the force knocking her off balance. The bride screamed, a sound so inhuman it sent shivers down their spines. Her body convulsed, her movements jerky and unnatural as she tried to pull the shard free. "Run!" The injured man yelled, his voice. The group didn't need to be told twice. They bolted down the road, adrenaline pushing them past their limits. Behind them, the bride's shrieks turned into guttural laughter. "You think this is over?" Her voice echoed, distorted and otherworldly. "You're mine forever." They didn't look back, their terror driving them forward until they reached a small gas station on the edge of the forest. The fluorescent lights were a beacon of safety in the dark, and they burst inside, collapsing onto the floor. The attendant stared at them in shock, reaching for the phone to call the police. But even as they tried to explain what had happened, the man couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. Outside, in the shadow of the forest, a figure in white watched them, her smile unwavering. The bride was patient. Love always found a way. The harsh glow of the gas station lights felt surreal, offering a false sense of safety. The man clutched his side, his breaths ragged, his bloodied hands trembling. The injured couple slumped against the wall, their eyes wide with lingering terror. "She's not real," the man muttered to himself, his voice a fragile whisper. "She can't be real." The attendant returned from the back room, phone in hand. "Help's on the way," he said, his voice uncertain as he glanced at their disheveled, bloodied appearances. Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs grew louder, almost deafening, before plunging the station into darkness. A thick silence enveloped the room, broken only by the sharp gasp of the injured woman. "She's here," she whimpered, her voice cracking. The man grabbed a wrench from a nearby shelf, his grip slick with sweat. He scanned the room, his eyes darting to every shadow that stretched across the walls. The faint hum returned, this time accompanied by a soft, melodic tune. It was the bride's, a haunting melody that crawled into their ears and lodged itself deep within their minds. The door to the station creaked open. Cold air swept in, carrying with it the faint scent of roses mingled with blood. The man stepped forward, his heart pounding like a drum. "Show yourself," he yelled, his voice echoing in the confined space. The bride's laughter drifted through the darkness, soft and mocking. "Love is eternal," she whispered, her voice seeming to come from every direction at once. Suddenly, the injured man was yanked into the shadows with a sickening crunch. His scream was cut short, leaving the group frozen in terror. "Where is he?" the man shouted, swinging the wrench wildly. A figure emerged from the dark, a vision of beauty and horror. The bride's gown shimmered like silk, though it was streaked with fresh blood. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her smile was as cruel as ever. "You can't protect them," she said, her voice dripping with malice. The man lunged at her, the wrench aimed for her head. But she caught it with ease, twisting it out of his hands and throwing him to the ground. "Such a hero," she sneered, stepping over him. She turned her attention to the injured woman, who was trying to crawl away. The bride knelt beside her, running her fingers through her hair with a mockery of tenderness. "Do you love him?" she asked, her tone eerily sweet. The woman sobbed, shaking her head. Pity, the bride murmured. Love makes the pain so much more satisfying. Before she could strike, the man tackled her from behind, knocking her to the ground. The two struggled, her laughter mixing with his grunts of effort. You can't kill me, she hissed, her voice filled with unearthly rage. I'll never leave you. I'll take my chances, he growled, grabbing a broken shard of glass from the floor and plunging it into her chest. The bride let out a guttural scream, her body convulsing violently. The lights flickered back on, and seemed to dissolve, her form shimmering like a mirage. The man staggered to his feet, his body shaking with exhaustion. The bride was gone, her song silenced, but the bloodstains on the floor and walls were a grim reminder of her presence. Is she dead? The injured woman asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew better. Outside, the first rays of dawn pierced through the trees. The gas station felt quiet, almost too quiet, but as they huddled together, waiting for help, a faint whisper reached their ears. I'll always be watching. The bride's voice lingered in their minds, a chilling promise that their nightmare was far from over. The sun rose sluggishly, casting pale, muted light over the desolate gas station. The man sat slumped against the wall, his fingers twitching involuntarily. He hadn't spoken since the whisper, her voice, echoed in his mind. The injured woman sobbed quietly beside him, her face buried in her hands. The stillness was suffocating, but neither dared break it. The sound of distant sirens finally cut through the oppressive quiet. Relief flickered briefly in their eyes. But as the wail grew louder, so did something else, a faint, familiar hum drifting on the wind. No, the man muttered, his voice barely audible. He scrambled to his feet, peering out into the road. The sound grew closer, a haunting melody that wrapped around him like a noose. From the far end of the road, a figure emerged. The bride walked slowly, her gown dragging along the pavement, leaving streaks of blood in its wake. Her head tilted slightly, her expression unreadable. She can't be real, the woman choked, shaking her head in disbelief. The man's hand tightened around the crowbar he had retrieved earlier. His knuckles turned white as fear and adrenaline surged through him. The sirens drew nearer, the red and blue lights of a police car flashing in the distance. The man turned back to the woman. Stay behind me, his bride stopped a few feet away, her pale face framed by loose, bloodied curls. She smiled, her teeth gleaming unnaturally in the light. Do you think they can save you? She asked softly, her voice both seductive and mocking. The man stepped forward, positioning himself between the bride and the woman. Stay away from us, he shouted, his voice shaking. The bride laughed, a chilling, melodic sound that made the air around them feel heavier. You belong to me, she said. You all do. Before he could react, she lunged forward with inhuman speed. The man swung the crowbar, but she caught it mid-swing, twisting it effortlessly out of his hands. She slammed him against the wall. Her strength overwhelming, the woman screamed, but the bride ignored her, leaning in close to the man's ear. You should have accepted my love, she whispered. With a violent shove, she threw him to the ground. He gasped, clutching his ribs as pain radiated through his body. The police car screeched to a halt, two officers stepping out with their guns drawn, hands up. One of them barked. The bride turned slowly to face them, her smile widening. You're just in time, she said. One officer hesitated, his finger twitching on the trigger. The other didn't wait, firing a shot. The bullet hit the bride square in the chest, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head, looking down at the wound with mild curiosity. You'll have to do better than that, she said, her tone almost playful. She raised her hand, and the officer who fired suddenly dropped his weapon, clutching his throat as if something unseen was choking him. His partner froze, paralyzed by fear as the bride advanced. The man on the ground forced himself to his feet, ignoring the sharp pain in his side. Stop! He yelled, grabbing a jagged piece of metal from the wreckage of the station's shelves. The bride turned, her eyes locking onto his. You're persistent, she said, almost at her, plunging the metal shard into her back. She let out an ear-piercing scream, her body convulsing as a dark, viscous substance seeped from the wound. The bride staggered, her movements jerky and unnatural. She turned to face him, her smile faltering for the first time. "This isn't over," she hissed. With a final, guttural scream, her body dissolved into a black, swirling mist that dissipated into the air. The man collapsed to his knees, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. The remaining officer rushed to his side, but his words were distant, muffled by the pounding in his ears. The woman crawled over, her hands trembling as she touched his shoulder. "Is she gone?" He looked at her, his eyes hollow. "I don't think she ever will be." Far off in the distance, the faint hum of her song lingered, a haunting reminder that the bride's love was eternal, and so was her vengeance. The charred ruins of the gas station crackled behind them, throwing faint shadows across the blood-stained pavement. The man struggled to his feet, clutching his side where the bride had twisted his ribs. Every breath was agony, but he pushed forward, dragging the woman along with him. "We need to keep moving," he rasped, his voice hollow. The woman hesitated, glancing back at the smoking remains of the building. She's gone, isn't she?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man shook his head. "No. She's never gone." The distant hum grew louder, cutting through the night like a knife. The woman's eyes widened, and she stumbled as her legs buckled beneath her. The charred ruins of the gas station crackled behind them, throwing faint shadows across the blood-stained pavement. The man struggled to his feet, clutching his side where the bride had twisted his ribs. Every breath was agony, but he pushed forward, dragging the woman along with him. "We need to keep moving," he rasped, his voice hollow. The woman hesitated, glancing back at the smoking remains of the building. She's gone, isn't she?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man shook his head. "No. She's never gone." The distant hum grew louder, cutting through the night like a knife. The woman's eyes widened, and she stumbled as her legs buckled beneath her. "She's coming," she whispered. They stumbled into the nearby forest, the dense canopy swallowing them in darkness. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through them. The hum morphed into a chilling melody, wrapping around them like a suffocating fog. "She's toying with us," the man muttered, his grip tightening on the woman's hand. Ahead, the trees thinned, revealing an abandoned church, its skeletal frame bathed in moonlight. The bell tower loomed like a sentinel, and the broken stained glass windows seemed to stare at them with accusing eyes. "We'll hide there," the man said, though he knew it was a desperate, futile plan. They pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The creak echoing ominously through the empty nave. Dust swirled in the air, and the faint scent of decay lingered. Rows of broken pews stretched toward the altar, where a massive crucifix hung precariously, its savior's face cracked and weathered. The man shoved one of the pews against the door, his breaths ragged. "It won't hold her for long, but it might buy us time." The woman collapsed onto the cold stone floor, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. "Why is she doing this?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. What does she answer? He didn't know. All he knew was that she wouldn't stop until they were dead, or worse. The hum penetrated the thick walls, growing louder and more distorted. It was no longer just a sound but a presence, filling the air with malevolence. The crucifix began to sway, its chains groaning under an invisible force. The bride's voice echoed through the church, soft and mocking. "You can't hide from love." The woman let out a choked sob, curling into herself. The man grabbed a rusted candlestick from the altar, his knuckles white as he gripped it. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The laughter that followed was low and guttural, vibrating through their bones. The bride materialized at the far end of the nave, her burned gown hanging in tatters, her charred flesh glowing faintly in the dim light. Her eyes were pits of darkness, and her smile was wider than it should have been, stretching impossibly across her face. "You can't run forever," she said, her voice dripping with malice. You belong to me. The man stepped forward, brandishing the candlestick. Stay back. The bride tilted her head, her smile never faltering. You still don't understand, do you? She said softly. Love isn't about escape. It's about surrender. She moved with unnatural speed, appearing inches from him in a blink. He swung the candlestick. But she caught it effortlessly, twisting it from his grasp. Her other hand clamped around his throat, lifting him off the ground. The woman screamed, scrambling backward as the man struggled, clawing at the bride's unyielding grip. Let him go. The woman cried, grabbing a broken piece of wood from the floor. She lunged at the bride, stabbing her in the side. The bride let out a blood-curdling scream, dropping the man as she staggered back. Black ichor oozed from the wound, and the temperature in the room plummeted. You'll pay for that, the bride hissed, her voice distorted and inhuman.